I'm George Galloway.
I am Steve Topple.
Together we are Topple Galloway, appearing live in Neath, by the way,
Yes.
on the 26th of January. Over 100 tickets sold now, and still 10 days or more to go. I think we're going to have a good
I
audience.
know, as I said in before we started filming, I'm hardly a star of the stage and screen, George, although,
You will be.
as we said last week, I am Jesus,
Yes,
treading
exactly.
the boards.
Jesus hasn't been in the South Wales Valley for some decades.
Right, okay, interesting.
Anyway, if you want tickets, you can get them from the Gwyn Hall. That's Gwyn, Gwyn Hall. If you want to see this double act live, that's the place to do it. I'm appearing the next night, by the way, in Birmingham at the Old Rep Theatre. That's Sunday the 27th. Anyway, we are meeting here today in the wake of the worst parliamentary defeat ever suffered by any British government on any matter at any time in our history. That's a red letter day by any standards,
Right, yes.
Steve. I should also point out that we're meeting before the result of the no confidence motion tabled by Jeremy Corbyn immediately after the result last night. And so we're working on the assumption, that she survives that.
I think so, yeah. I mean, all the reports up till this point, which is around 10 a.m. on Wednesday, the 16th of January, all the reports indicate that the ERG group will vote in support of the government, that the DUP will vote in support of the government. So
Something absurd about that, let's not just gloss over that.
No.
More than 100 Tory MPs voted no confidence in Theresa May to lead their own party, but they're going to vote for her to lead the country.
Yeah.
And 118 of them rebelled on her BREXIT deal that she spent well over 2 years negotiating. Her flagship policy was sunk by them just last evening, but this evening they're voting for her to carry on. It's a bit like a carry-on film.
We keep making this reference, don't we, that
Yes.
this government is like carry-on film.
Carry on up the Khyber without a paddle.
Yes, or yes, carry on at your convenience, if you remember that one.
I do, yes.
Look, I mean, it is a ludicrous situation that these Tory MPs can somehow feel for sort of party loyalty and party interest that they can vote in favour of this government when they just voted against the issue which Corbyn has raised the problem with last night, as it were. Let's not hold our breath. I think it will go in her way, but it would be interesting to see if there are any defectors.
Well, all it needs, the margin of error is so slim that all it needs is a couple of taxis to go the wrong way around Westminster and get lost in the one-way system or caught up in traffic. I mean, it is actually that close,
but it's
even
also,
if these people do support her.
Yeah, it's also a damning indictment, though, of their view of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, that, in my opinion, that they are so concerned that he might actually win a general election, that they're willing to push all their views on Theresa May, all their views on the Brexit deal to one side, to so desperately stop the prospect of going to the polls with him,
Yeah, I think you put it the right way. It's not that they're desperate to avoid Jeremy Corbyn being the Prime Minister, because he could only be the Prime Minister if he won the general election. It's the general election they're afraid of. In other words, they're afraid of their own people, which of course puts them on a par with quite a few governments. But I was on Talk Sport with Alan Brazil this morning talking about it. Alan, of course, a football icon and broadcasting. He was a player for Ipswich. That was his best days. But he also played at Celtic, Manchester United, Tottenham Hotspur. He's a very big football icon. And moreover, undoubtedly the best sports broadcaster in the English-speaking world. He's been there 18 years. So I really like Alan. But his payoff line, when I put it to him that the bookmakers were clear anyway, that if there was a general election, Jeremy Corbyn would be the Prime Minister, his payoff line was, well, I'm heading to EasyJet to get out of here.
Gone down in my estimations then.
Well, what they're actually saying is they don't want to give the British people the chance to pick a government that can undo this Gordian knot that is now around our throat, if that's not to mix too many metaphors. So, I mean, let me take you back to this point. It is unbelievably been glossed over in the mass media that as a matter of democratic principle, in any other time, in any other government, in any other country, the Prime Minister would already have tendered her resignation. Yes. And it's just been accepted that, well, she can carry on at your convenience. If you have effectively cleared every other domestic matter off the table, spent more than 2 years on a flagship policy, and it gets sunk, all guns blazing, it goes down with all hands, the captain of the ship takes responsibility. It's astounding that most of the mainstream journalists have just glossed over that point. But you were telling me something about someone who might be a weather vane in this on my very own talk radio this morning.
Yes, indeed. It was a fascinating tweet from Ms. Julia Hartley-Brewer, who I'm not a fan
Heartless brute, as we call her. In the building.
Yeah. Oh, really? Backstage gossip there. I'm not a fan of her politics. I mean, I know her vaguely well, having been on a show quite a few times, and she's not the sort of devil people make out she is, to be fair to her. However, she made a fascinating tweet last night. She called for a general election, obviously on the basis that she thinks the Conservative Party will win, but purely because of what you just stated, that the fact that Theresa May has made such an almighty mess of this process that the only correct way forward in any functioning democracy, which we don't have, the only way forward would be to put it to the public and have a new leader installed to carry on the process. But I mean, it's a damning indictment, George, of the state of, firstly, democracy in this country, that we're not at that point, or we should have been at that point months ago. Anyway.
There is another option, Steve. It's not as good and it doesn't solve the problem in the same way. But the Tories could get rid of Theresa May and put someone else up as their leader. Now, again, it's being said that on paper that cannot happen because the ERG perhaps shot their bolt early in December by having one already, making her on paper invulnerable until next December.
Because it has to be 12 months, doesn't it?
Yeah. But as Bill Shankly, the famous Liverpool Football Club manager, once said when a journalist put to him, on paper you should beat this team, and he said, yes, but football's not played on paper, it's played on grass. And in the old days, I was just writing about this in my RT.com column today. In the old days, there was nothing so vulgar as votes or elections in the Conservative Party. In my own lifetime, the leader of the Conservative Party emerged. And they emerged from what was called the magic circle of Tory grandees. In those days, they had real grandees.
Many of those.
Now they're garagistes, second-hand garagistes.
Or as I would say, a bunch of scroats.
Yes. But the grandees would effectively get together in a smoke-filled room, and they'd agree amongst themselves who was a sound enough chap to go to the palace. And they would then effectively say to the Queen, we think you should pick this one. And quite often that was one with much less of a claim than the alternatives. I don't want to take you too far back in history, but when Harold Macmillan retired, Rab Butler, R.E.B. Butler, was the obvious standout, and he thought he was, shoo-in for the leadership. But the magic circle didn't think he was quite sound enough on one or two points. And so they recommended someone who was in the House of Lords, the Earl of Hume, the 16th Earl of Hume, as Harold Wilson always referred to him, who then renounced his peerage and became Sir Alec Douglas Hume and became the Prime Minister of Britain, all without a vote being cast.
Yes.
So these grandees are not what they were. The men in grey suits are now men and women, and few of them wear grey suits. I saw one in a pink suit sitting behind Kenneth Clark yesterday, dressed by Coco the Clown.
Kenneth Clark didn't have a coronary, George.
Yes, exactly. So they're not what they were, but they must still exist.
Can I just interject?
Can they not go in and say to Theresa May, look, old girl, you've done your best, but you really can't continue.
That's a fascinating point, yes, and exactly. You would think that, as you say, there are no grandees left. It's made up of ex-corporate bankers and lawyers and PR people and Oxbridge students. Now the Conservative Party, there's the sort of the hereditary vein of the way the Conservative Party used to function doesn't exist anymore. But that's a fascinating point, because they still, the 1922 committee still holds power, and you would think
and
that
its
pressure
leader voted against her last night.
and you would think that behind the scenes pressure could be applied to her to have to go, I quit, whether she wants to or not.
Well, to continue Sir Geoffrey Howe's metaphor, when he devastatingly, effectively began the breaking down and overthrow of Margaret Thatcher, he said, you know, when the captain of the team is sending people out to bat, having broken the bat and the wickets and the bails before she goes to bat, cricket becomes impossible. In those days, the Tories liked cricketing metaphors even more than they do now. But the point is, how can she now go back with any credibility to the European Union and say, right, now let's begin again, when the gap is such that what could the EU offer her that could close such a gap? I mean, I don't know, giving her a crown, Charlemagne's hereditary Holy Roman Empire. I mean, what could they offer Britain now on a deal that has been so completely devastating?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, the sort of noises off coming from the EU last night in reaction to the vote was that the negotiations will not be reopened. That they're not willing to budge very far, as it were. And it's like. It seems an impossible situation, doesn't it?
It is, Gordian knot. It can't be unravelled in any way other than a general election. That is why the general election demand has to remain front and foremost, not a diversion by Labour into the Waitrose camp for a second referendum and so on. Only a general election can break this logjam. But if the Tories went to Mrs. May and said, look, your time's up, at least they would then have an incentive, an excuse, an explanation for then bringing forward legislation to pause Article 50, to give some time for a new Tory leader to be chosen and to get to know the lie of the land, the lie of the continental land, to meet the European leaders and so on. It would take the immediate crisis off the table. So why don't they do that? Is Theresa May such a whizzing leader that they're ready to die on a hill for her?
Do you think that is what's going to happen? Because I was racking my brains watching it all unfold last night, and I've been racking my brains on the way here this morning to try and see what the outcome of this debacle is. And she's not going to win the no confidence vote. It's not going to happen. So therefore, any standard mechanism to force a general election will not happen. So really, the only movement is going to come from within the Conservative Party itself.
Well, if I was them, Steve, this is what I would do. I would, I'd get a new leader. I'd press a pause on Article 50. I'd try and renegotiate with the EU. And if I got nowhere specific, as a matter of fact, I think they probably would get some concessions with a new Prime Minister.
I think so.
And then I'd say, I'm now going to hold a general election to support my policy, my deal with the European Union, such as it might be. And with a new Prime Minister, they'd undoubtedly have a better chance than they would by going into an election with Theresa May, although she has already declared she will not fight another election. Talk about a lame duck. So if I were in the Tory party, that's what I'd be arguing today in the tea room. And there will be whispers of sedition, there must be, because this conundrum can only be broken in one of two ways. Either you hold a general election with the risk that your whole party is broken and put out of power, and Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister of Britain, or we get rid of Theresa May. She's not exactly Winston Churchill. She's not exactly Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she is the lamest of ducks. who has made a series of blunders that have brought us to this place. Again, in my piece this morning, I adumbrate those. On the first morning, she should have, on the first day that she became leader, she should have reached out to Corbyn and attempted to involve him in the negotiations, and thus face the EU with a united British front. She didn't do that. Instead, she spent the next period painting Corbyn as an agent of the Kremlin or the IRA or Hezbollah or whatever else. In fact, it's been all of those.
Yes, and more.
So,
Czechoslovakia.
You know, now, she said last night after the vote she was going to reach out to senior parliamentarians, except the leader of the opposition. She doesn't regard the leader of the opposition as senior enough.
Probably John Mann, maybe.
John Mann, Frank Field, that's
Yes.
the kind of senior parliamentarian she has in mind. So that was the first blunder. The second blunder, whilst strolling in her lederhosen on her Bavarian walking holiday, the idea occurred to her, presumably having imbibed her own propaganda, that she could call a new general election and completely destroy this Russian stooge, Jeremy Corbyn. So she called an election she didn't need to have and threw away the majority she then enjoyed. So thus leaving her dependent on the tassels of the orange sashes of the Democratic Unionists. And then you're trying to negotiate a Brexit where the Northern Irish border becomes the border between Britain and the EU, but you're already legally bound for that not to be a border at all.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the classic irresistible force and an immovable object. These two things cannot be squared. She would like to ditch Northern Ireland, and I so wish she would, and then Northern Ireland could reunite with Ireland, but she cannot because she needs the 10 DUP votes. So that was the second blunder. But the third blunder was to go into Maybot mode and just endlessly repeat the same mantras, both over there and here. Make no preparation for a no-deal Brexit. So the EU knew that there was never going to be a no-deal Brexit, and therefore had no need to offer you anything to avoid it.
Yeah.
I mean, a leader who can squeeze that many blunders of that dimension into such a short period of time, why would you want to die on a hill for her?
No, absolutely. And I think if point 5, if you like, in that, which I noticed last night and I think is being underplayed by the press, or not mentioned by the press really at all, is that she has now surrounded herself as well with a cabinet of absolute buffoons, because she's run out of options with regards to who she can appoint as ministers now after so many.
We don't even know their names, do we?
No, I've lost count of how many
Name the
people...
Brexit secretary. I couldn't.
Can't remember.
And we're political junkies.
Yes, I have no idea. She's surrounded herself by so many buffoons and other lame ducks, if you like. It's also a perfect storm. There's a fascinating, about 3-minute segment on Politics Live last night where Andrew Neil was interviewing Matt Hancock, who's now the Health Secretary. And
It was a good interview.
It was brilliant. Well, this is the problem with Andrew Neil. He's extremely good at what he does. He's just an arsehole.
I like him, but that's another matter. I say for the
we'll
record.
discuss that off air.
It's a Scottish thing.
Oh, right, okay, fair enough. He was interviewing Matt Hancock, Health Secretary, and the news broke that the EU was not willing to open renegotiations, and it exposed that May has surrounded herself with little mini-me May-bots who, if they have to go off script or something spontaneous happens, they literally fall apart, because he literally collapsed under the weight of Andrew Neil's interviewing because something came up which he was unexpected and he had no answer to. You literally watched him crumble, and he kept repeating the same.
Priceless,
It was priceless. He kept repeating the same line, which had no relevance to what
Like a
Andrew Neil was
robot
asking.
going off program,
It was,
wasn't
and
it?
I think that's crucial.
I am a robot.
Yeah.
I am a robot.
And I think that's also crucial to this. She has got a cabinet of absolute dullards, and that's another. There's a point that Labour should be sort of accentuating that she's surrounded by absolute buffoons.
Yes, because in a normal
Yes,
normal polity,
exactly.
if you look back at when your father was active in politics, Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister. There was 10 members of his cabinet who could take over as Prime Minister in the afternoon. And most of them wanted to. You know, Jenkins, Benn, Crossland, Crossman, Castle, Callaghan. I mean, I could go on. Believe me, there were about 10 in Wilson's cabinet. In this cabinet,
no one, is there?
Who? The only alternative leaders are ex-cabinet.
Yeah.
So, you know, Andrea Leadsom is the best they can they can field.
Cheers.
So, what we're witnessing, and it's abundantly clear as we talk, is the complete degeneration of the Conservative Party. Once a Rolls Royce, now a Skoda from the 1980s. Low rent, low grade, unable to cope with the demands that are on it.
Yeah.
In which case, it is a democratic outrage that there is not now irresistible force in the country for a new general election, which at the very least changes the arithmetic. It doesn't necessarily improve the quality of your government, but it changes the arithmetic. And that's what's screaming out now for a change. But let's turn to Jeremy Corbyn's dilemma. I think he's played a blinder, by the way, in terms of the cards that were available to him, and surrounded as he is by backstabbers and traitors. He has, in just a couple of years, broken the Theresa May premiership, even if it now survives the day. It's broken. Everyone can see she's a dead woman walking. But now, if he loses tonight, as we assume he will, 100 Labour MPs, that is to say 40% of his strength, are going to pivot, according to Sky News' Beth Rigby, and begin a demand for a second referendum. Now, you and I both know 65% of Labour-held constituencies voted leave in the referendum. 75% of the marginal seats that they need to win to form a government voted leave in the referendum. If Labour now becomes the anti-Brexit party, which is what a second referendum party will look like and will be perceived as, Corbyn's over.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. He's played a blinder. I was discussing this as we were watching it pan out last night. I was discussing this with Nicola. And everything has gone according to plan for him from very sort of early on last year up until the tail end of 2018, when he was pushing back against the force from the Blairite moderates in his party to call a confidence vote. Then he held firm, knowing that the right time, the best time, as you say, with the cards he had, would be after the vote on the actual deal itself. And it has gone according to plan. But, like as you also say with your card analogy, it was never going to be perfect anyway, because there was always going to be this chance that we're now seeing play out, that the confidence vote would be a fairly null and void exercise, that he wouldn't win it. But you're correct, that it's going to put Labour in a right pickle now, not least, as you say, the people's vote, but not least the contingent of that Blairite moderate Umuna wing, who will now go, well, Corbyn's failed again, we need a new leader,
Yeah, or leave, maybe. That is another another possible outcome of all this, is the Tories become two parties and Labour becomes two parties.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, the thing is, the sort of calls for proportional representation, the complete change to our voting system in this country are growing. The Labour, Corbyn, McDonnell, etc. have again made noises off towards being in favour of proportional representation. If these two main parties did split,
it would become irresistible.
Then it would become, it would have to happen, if you like. Will that happen? I mean, I've been banging on about this for several years now.
Yeah, me too.
We keep waiting,
we shouldn't, I mean, because I want it so much, one shouldn't allow that to be the father of expectation. But it is definitely a possible outcome. So, for example, if Corbyn now disappoints them and says, no, I'm still not going for a so-called people's vote, I call it the Waitrose vote, if Corbyn says no, Mrs. Thatcher had 7 goes at a no-confidence motion in James Callaghan before she eventually brought him down. And we're prepared to go 17. And if he says that, what do these 100 plus Labour MPs do? Do they stage a coup, which is one possibility? Do they effectively overthrow Corbyn as the leader, or at least of the parliamentary Labour Party, and say, I now, Chuka Amuna, speak for more MPs than Jeremy Corbyn does, therefore the Speaker must recognise me as the leader of the opposition. That's one possibility. Another is an organic split and the launch of the long-awaited New Umuna Party. Good luck with that. They've got plenty of money, but that is about all, I think. So, in other words, this is quite a pickle, isn't it?
It is a pickle for everyone, yes, and of course this is without...
And by the way, the clock's ticking. We leave, if nothing else happens, we leave in about 70 days from now.
And the biggest pickle in all of this, George, really, for me, is as well, I mean, firstly, in spite of Brexit, the UK continues to trot along on this demonic course which the Tories have set us on.
Isn't that amazing that in the midst of all this, we're still talking about interfering with other people in the rest of the world?
I know.
Sending warships, opening bases.
Exactly.
We can't even pay our collective electricity bill.
Exactly. And of
Did
course,
you see Pike in the week? Don't tell him your name, Pike!
Yes, that kind of. I mean, we should have brought that up when I was talking about the cabinet, actually. But yes, so moving on.
You forgot about him.
I know, Gavin Williamson,
the fireplace salesman.
Moving on, yes. So Gavin Williamson. This was reported this week that Gavin Williamson. Sorry, but this is such a mad story. Gavin Williamson told a Ministry of Defence meeting that one of the options he had in mind with regards to the, if you like, policing of Gibraltar.
Spanish intrusion.
Spanish intrusion.
Our waters of Spain.
Of Spain. I mean, if that's not nonsense enough, I'm not sure what is. But one of the solutions...
Gilbert and Sullivan.
One of the intrusions into our waters by the Spanish would be arming all the citizens of Gibraltar with paintball guns and allowing them to blast Spanish ships.
He's not making that up.
I'm not making it up. It's the most bloody ridiculous thing I've ever...
He said that to general, in the presence of generals,
but
who leaked it.
Yeah, yes, which is very telling in itself, though, on a serious note. I mean, that's quite...
Well, we do have an aircraft carrier with no aircraft, so why not paintball?
No, exactly.
They don't hurt people. So the Spanish Navy, Spanish ships would be going around carrying the hallmark of Britain, a paintball on their hulls.
But of course, I mean... It's just absolutely mad. It is, again, it's like a carry-on film. But of course, the other more serious note on that was he was talking about sending a British destroyer into the area to monitor. I mean, what? The fact.
I don't know.
It just beggars belief. No,
anymore.
I don't.
He sent one to the Azov Sea. Into Russian waters, although I predict that it will not actually go into Russian waters, because I predict the Russians would sink it if it did. He's sent one to the South China Sea,
yes, of course,
clue being in the name. He's got assets, as they call them, in the Persian Gulf, again, the clue being in the name. And now he's talking about sending one to Spain, our EU partner, our NATO ally.
And this is the point, because as we discussed previously, that May has surrounded herself by absolute dullards in her cabinet. So on the one hand, you have a situation where Theresa May and the Conservative government are effectively reliant on the EU to give way in somewhat to sustain them as a governing party in this country with the mess that's now happening. And yet they're threatening one of the main countries of the EU with splatter guns, like something out of Bugsy Malone.
That would be better, actually. The Bugsy Malone Tommy gun.
We could be anything that we want it to be.
firing cream pies.
So well, exactly. So you're threatening one of the main countries in the EU, while on the other hand, desperately needing them to come on board to save your own skin. I mean, you literally couldn't make this up. And as I said before, it highlights the sham of our democracy in this country, that we're even in this position to start with. What we didn't discuss that came out last week was the fact that one Margaret Littlewood, I believe, is it Margaret Littlewood? Margaret someone or other, was charged with and was found guilty of electoral fraud in Thanet by the Electoral Commission.
Oh, yeah.
She was found guilty of electoral fraud, 2 years suspended sentence, but let off. And the judge said that there was a culture of deception within parts of the Conservative Party. But once again, this was, of course, the culmination of this nearly 2 years of investigation by the Electoral Commission into dozens of
This
Tory
was the
MPs,
shock,
spending in
the
2015.
shock Nigel Farage defeat in
Yes.
Thanet, where UKIP won 26 council seats, but on the same day, Nigel
Couldn't
Farage
get an
lost.
MP.
Rather, I remember thinking at the time, if I was Farage, I'd be going to court over that.
And this was the end result of not only Thanet South, but also every other investigation that was happening in the country. That one lone woman, who was effectively just a sort of campaign bod, if you like, was the only person in the whole Conservative Party who was found guilty of any form of electoral fraud. Now, my point being that, as I say, this is the sham of the democracy that we live in this country, regardless of what you think of the rules surrounding electoral spending, that effectively the Conservatives did get away with, because they were found to have overspent. They can get away with overspending in the 2015 general election. Nothing is done about it. And if it hadn't been for that overspending, we might have been in a very different position in that election. Ed Miliband could have won, for all we know. I mean, I'm not saying it could have happened. I don't think it would have. But the proposition is there that Ed Miliband could have won. And we wouldn't even be discussing Brexit today.
How amazing.
This is the absolute
All
nonsense.
these things are overlooked. I was unaware that the case had finished
There we go.
in
Exactly.
Thanet.
Yep.
But there are lots of things being overlooked. Homeless people are dying of the cold in doorways. A sheriff in Dundee, my home
saw
city,
that,
yesterday refused to sentence a woman caught nicking food from Marks and Spencer, while you still can, as they've just announced the raft of
Stores
closures.
closing, yeah.
He refused to sentence her because he was persuaded that she was stealing food to eat as being the only alternative to starvation.
Yeah.
And that's quite a Rubicon, you know, when a bewigged judge says, this woman is living on £90 a month. That is impossible. Therefore, it ceases to be a crime in the normal sense of the word to steal food in order to avoid starving to death.
It's quite a precedent.
In Britain, in 2019. Unemployment, redundancies, closures. What a mess we're in.
It is. And this is, to be honest with you, George, this is my overall issue with Brexit. While I'm happy to, I have to be honest, while I'm happy to sit here and talk about it, because it is, of course it's important. I'm not going to deny it's not important. But up until this point, everything has been in spite of Brexit. And as I've repeatedly said, I think this whole decade, even if you take Brexit out of the equation, this whole decade, what has happened, what has gone on, the left-wing response over the course of the past 8 years, not just looking at Corbyn's response in a nutshell, but you have to look at the left's response since 2010. History is not going to view us kindly this decade, because I literally wrote an article on Monday, which no one picked up on. Everyone ignored it until I wrote it, and then suddenly all the mainstream press decided to pick up on it and run with it. That from April 2013 to April 2018, 21,000 claimants died waiting for the DWP to make a decision over their benefits. This was not my figures, this was the DWP's. They had to admit this after Madeleine Moon, Labour MP, asked a parliamentary question. 21,000 people died before the DWP made a decision whether or not they were entitled to any money whatsoever. Now, of this, nearly 5,000 of them were cancer patients who the DWP literally left waiting for money, even though they had cancer. And yet the DWP thought, well, no, you need to have an assessment. We need to check that you're actually ill enough to warrant us giving you some pennies. 9,000 didn't even have their illness registered with the DWP, which my interpretation was that the DWP had dragged their heels with their claims so long it hadn't even got to that stage where they were assessed to find out what the DWP thought was actually wrong with them. And this is in spite of Brexit. And I put out a tweet last night, and I stand by this tweet, that in 20 years' time, when poor, sick, disabled, homeless people are living off soup kitchens in slums because we have not dealt with the mess outside of the Brexit debacle, we will look back at this whole situation and wonder what the hell we were getting ourselves in such knots about. Because regardless of Brexit, George, regardless of Brexit, what I call the corporatist machine will carry on regardless, because it has carried on regardless.
Only if we elect governments to do that.
But this is...
At least if we... By the way, all of that misery that you just so eloquently described happened when we were in the European Union.
Yes.
The point about Brexit is it allows us to be free to elect a different kind of government, to bring about a different kind of society. At this moment, whilst we're in the EU, we are nailed onto a cross which says we must have a market economy. Well, I don't want a market economy. The market economy is what led to all of that misery that you've just described. We're being told to wrap up. So, I've been George Galloway.
I have been Steve Topple.
Together we've been Topple Galloway. Follow us on Twitter, at Mr. Topple, at George Galloway. Come and see us in Neath, in the Gwyn Hall. And if not, tune in next week at the same time.